All right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We are a free, pluralistic, and transnational university and charity founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub. I am Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, an investigation into religion and belief systems, which is part of a 3-month practice-based residency program where we are unraveling belief systems and the relationship with politics, economics, and nation states. I would like to welcome our participants in the program and also to any visiting participants. If there are any of you, I kindly ask you for a donation to our charity so we can keep running these incredible programs and support the lecturers that we invite. So this talk is going to be 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So please write your question in the chat so our guests can be aware of where the questions are going, and at the end I will call you individually. And today I want to introduce Professor Yvonne Chireau, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And Yvonne is an authority on African-based religions, such as Santeria and Voodoo in Africa. In America, religion and healing and Black American religion. She's also interested in religion and comics, manga, and graphic novels. Yvonne is the author of Black Magic, African American Religion, and the Conjuring Tradition. She has also co-edited with Nathaniel Deutsch, Black Zion, African American Religions, and Judaism. She has published several articles in publications such as the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, Journal of Interdenominational Theological Center, and Religion and American Culture, a Journal of Interpretation. Professor Chireau teaches courses on religion in America, African American religions, folk and popular religions, women and religion, and Black women's spirituality. She received her BA from Mount Holyoke College, her M.T.S. from Harvard Divinity School, and her Ph.D. from Princeton University. So this is certainly going to be a really exciting and enlightening lecture. So Yvonne, we are all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. You keep popping in and out. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm going to try to share the screen. Okay. All right. So I'm starting with this this slide because there are 3 of my favorite people on there. And you can take notes on this because I have a lot to cover, but just a second. I'm sorry, I was getting an echo. So the person all the way on my right is a very famous conjure woman by the name of Carolyn Dye. The person in the middle, does anyone know who the person in the middle is? Famous anthropologist, author, novelist, playwright, Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the first people to study African-American magic traditions. And so we owe a lot to her. The third person is an artist by the name of Renee Stout, who has created a persona, an artistic persona where she herself is a conjure woman. So I thought this was really wonderful to start this way and to really put the emphasis on Black women. Okay, Black magic refers to ancestral traditions of African-American healing, harming, and spiritual empowerment. And so my question is, does black magic matter? And so I want to look at this idea of black magic today, and I'm going to try to squeeze in a lot in here. So take notes, and if you have questions, raise them later. Black magic is also called hoodoo. It's also called conjure. It's also called root working. These are all traditions of African-American healing, harming, supernatural protection, divination, magical creation, and perhaps most importantly, spiritual resistance. Now, this is important. When I say black magic, I'm doing a play on words. It's called black because it's a distinctive tradition that began with Black American people, our African ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. The word magic simply refers to belief and practice using spirits, words, narration, and materiality to effect changes in reality. Religion does similar things, okay? But magic is a different thing. Simply put, magic is the manifestation of intent, okay? This is magic. The play on words part comes, it's called black because it has been associated by those who opposed it with evil sorcery, with sinister rituals, with demonic power, the very inverse of good spirituality and religion. So the question I want to raise is, does black magic matter? So first, let's define some terms. Can everybody see those? It's all up there. I put these together really quickly, and I know they're sloppy, so bear with me. So I want to give you some terms, all right? Voodoo, New Orleans voodoo, and hoodoo. These are the four main categories that we look at when we talk about black magic. And I start here because it's really important for all of us to know something about African religions, indigenous African religions. Why? Because now they are global religions. With the diaspora of African people worldwide, we have the venerable Yoruba traditions like Santeria or Candomblé in Brazil, or Ifa all over the world. Okay, so these indigenous African religions have gone all over the planet. All right, so it's really important that we know something about them. The word that we never want to use, and when you leave this class, we never want to use the word voodoo. Okay, and I'll talk about why. So these are the four terms. Just very quickly, I'll talk about them. The main point takeaway here, and if you look at this image with the drummers and with this the woman dancing, very hard to identify where it's from. So if you look very closely, and I put this on a test for you, wow, where are each of these images? It might be kind of hard. In fact, you could say, well, it could be anywhere, right? And that's really the point. When African people were captured and enslaved, they brought their cultures, their spiritual concepts with them, their ways of embodying spirituality with them everywhere in the Western Hemisphere. So everywhere you look, some of these characteristics will be displayed. Here, the emphasis on drumming. This is actually an image from Haiti, from Haiti, and the woman with who's dancing with the serpent. This is an image from the United States. But you will find similar sorts of patterns and images wherever you go. And I think that's really important. The other important thing that I leave at the bottom here, for those of you who are interested in studying this, the most important determinant of what these traditions look like, whether they're magic or religion, is African culture, like the starting culture, all right, and slavery, okay? Slavery was different all over the world, and slavery created the environments in which these religions emerged. Okay, so really quickly, some of these terms. Vodun is a term that you probably don't see too much about. Vodun is an indigenous religion that is found today in Benin and Togo, West Africa, and also Nigeria. It is the state religion in Benin. There's not a consistent orthography, you guys, so you might see voodoo sometimes, but in a second, I'll tell you why it's never a good idea to call things voodoo, all right? But Vodun is a very sophisticated monotheism. It has a belief in an almighty God and multiple spiritual beings that are called Vodun, and these are nature beings, all right? And the tradition of Vodun is managed by experts like this priest and this priestess who are able to interact and engage with these spiritual beings. And just very quickly, the Vodun, like all gods with the small g, they're intelligent, they're responsive, and they can be thought of as forces that relate to the elements, all right? And I could give you some examples of them. Vodou, differently from Vodou, is a religion that's found in Haiti. And I believe that you'll be having a speaker talking specifically about Vodou in Haiti. Vodou originated in Haiti among enslaved Africans in the 1600s, when these African people were brought to the Caribbean to work the sugar crop. And by the 1700s, Haiti was the richest island in the Caribbean. But Vodou, the religion itself, begins as a religion of resistance against slavery. So this is the image of the founding story of when these brave enslaved African people came together and basically called upon the deities of Africa, all right? So Vodou in Haiti is a religion that celebrates Africa while recalling the bitterness of slavery. Very, very similar to Passover in Judaism, recalling what it was like to be enslaved and the bitterness of slavery, and then celebrating freedom. Because as you know, Vodou is unique in all the African-based religions in the world because it played an important role in securing freedom for enslaved people. It inspired the first successful revolution of its kind in the Western Hemisphere that freed the slaves. So it's really considered a religion of resistance at the start. This is the only place that I want you to use the term voodoo. And voodoo is a very distinctive and unique tradition that comes around in Louisiana, in the colony of Louisiana, and parts of the lower Mississippi Valley in the 1800s. It does not survive past slavery. Basically, voodoo, New Orleans voodoo, is a religion that went underground. There are famous figures. You'll see this, the person in the picture. This is Marie Laveau. She is a priestess that's associated with New Orleans voodoo, but also she was a practitioner of magic. So here in this tradition in New Orleans, you have the convergence of magic and religion in this New Orleans version. Okay, and then finally, this is this is where I want to explain why I don't like the word voodoo, and I don't like people to use it. It's not a precise term. Voodoo has been used as a way of describing African spirituality, always held up in contrast to Christianity. In the United States, voodoo becomes, very early on, becomes a derogatory slur. It's used to characterize Black spirituality during slavery and afterwards. And what are some of the associations? Well, specifically, it's a very racist kind of characterization. Indigenous African religions are presented as primitive, uncivilized, relative to Christianity, which is a superior faith. Eventually, voodoo becomes a cultural signifier. It is associated with white terror. It's associated with fear of Black supernaturalism and magic. And it really is a term that tries to characterize all African religions or all African-based religions. It becomes sort of a junk word while degrading and misrepresenting and ridiculing it. So we really do have to be kind of careful with this word, okay? And here are some of the depictions of African religion that inspired this notion of voodoo, sort of this primitive, the emotional, the dancing, the sensational aspects, all right? So finally, what I wanna talk about today is Hudu. Now, and I know these are a lot of terms, so ask me questions later. Hudu is the form of spirituality that survived in the United States from indigenous African origins, but it was hidden within the slave community against all odds. We call this the invisible institution. Instead of being reconstituted as a new religion like Haitian Vodou or Cuban Santeria or Candomblé in Brazil, Hudu was born out of an older African spirituality that was not attached to any specific religion. So the term Hudu, as I use it, describes a tradition of beings, persons, charms, spells, and magical workings by enslaved Black people. And I posted some readings for this week that you can sort of refer to as I go along. Hudu can be considered a positive or a negative depending on your perspective. And I want to talk about ethics and morality before we finish today. Okay. Roots and root work refer specifically to the use of certain natural and organic objects in the performance of magical actions, whether healing, okay, using the leaf for healing or poisoning, or even using the leaf for supernatural protection. The other term that we find that's used a lot is the term conjure. Conjure simply refers to magical interventions with the spirits of people, dead or alive, angels, saints, and other beings. So really, hoodoo is sort of an overarching term to describe magic. So here's a glimpse into the world of African Black cultural, Black magic. This is very important, and this is what I want to say before we get out of here. Even though onlookers, people who were not part of the enslaved community, described Black religion and Black spirituality and hoodoo as fetishism, sorcery, witchcraft, heathenism, these are the words. We must understand that in part, this is a rationalization for enslavement and controlling African American people, even using these ideas to convert them to Christianity. By calling these things devil worship, paganism, idolatry, they reflect how religious difference is really embedded in the European and European American mindset at this time. European white was synonymous with Christian, but Black is synonymous with voodoo, which is all that other stuff. We know that these African religions were broken, fragmented, incompletely transmitted during slavery, all due to the separation and trauma of the Middle Passage. So hoodoo is born out of that fragmentation. And it's really an extraordinary thing. Out of that, hoodoo incorporates elements from the environment. Spirits of nature, spirits of the land are brought in. It's a very much of a nature spirituality. It adopts Native American Indian deities. It adopts even European folk deities, fairies, magical beings, and so forth. And this is what's so really interesting, it incorporates aspects of Christianity. So in some ways, I don't know if any of you have ever had this dish in Louisiana. They like to talk about a dish called gumbo. And gumbo is a dish where they put all kinds of things. It's got meat, it's got seafood, it's got rice, it's got all kinds of vegetables. This is what hoodoo is. It's a gumbo, it's a Creole, which is bringing in different elements to create something new. And this is characteristic of Black American magic. Okay, so just very, very quickly. One of the things, I'll show you this slide first. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is the way that this spiritual tradition is embedded in artifacts. So those of you who are interested in art, you will find this to be really fascinating because there is a strong material cultural tradition as part of this spiritual tradition. So materiality and the artifacts and the use of objects, sometimes ordinary objects, in order to change and to create reality, which is what magic does. This is something that I think is very beautiful and fascinating at the same time. Okay, so one more thing, and then I'm gonna stop because I could go on talking about this for all. The functions of hoodoo, this is important. They range not only from healing, from being able to cure, sort of like a folk medicine, to retrieving lost objects, divination, predicting the future, causing individuals to fall in love. There's a lot of sex and love magic here. Gaining riches and wealth. There's a lot of gambling magic here. Good fortune. But I would note that all of these things were really important to Black Americans, both during and after slavery. Okay, but probably the most important and salient concern of Black magic is safety and defense against racist domination and protection against violence. So here's a picture of High John the Conqueror. And High John the Conqueror is probably the most well-known material object because High John is not only a being, a spiritual being, but he takes the form of a root. And it's actually you know, it looks like a sweet potato, but it's actually a very phallic root. And that there's a reason for that. High John the Conqueror becomes the most powerful charm in hoodoo magic in the United States. And I'll tell you why. I mentioned that hoodoo practitioners are able to work forces and powers for aggression, to protect themselves against physical harm, but also self-defense and actual warfare, as we saw in Haiti and other places where you had slave revolts and rebellions. Hoodoo plays an important part in the United States. And I'm going to give you two stories and two examples. And they're actually mentioned in the readings that I posted. Two of the most noted accounts of Black magic have to do with spiritual defense during slavery in the 1800s. And this includes the use of magic by Gullah Jack during the South Carolina, Denmark, BC conspiracy. And this was 1822. And the story of the root charm by Frederick Douglass in 1845. I'm gonna talk more about Douglass in a second. But the story of Gullah Jack, I posted something, it's mentioned in the readings and the books that are there. The Denmark BC conspiracy was an uprising against slavery that occurred in 1822 in South Carolina. It involved both slaves and free Black people. And the resistance was planned in the African Methodist Church. So you have an interesting thing. There are Christians, there are African people, there are African-American people, all coming together and believing that God gave them the sanction to strike out for their freedom. Okay, so they're reading the Bible a certain way. They come together in the church, and the church is called Emmanuel AME. And it is one of the tragedies, ironic tragedies of history, that in 2015, this church was attacked by a white supremacist by the name of Dylann Roof in the United States. 2015, he killed 9 people. At the time of the conspiracy and the rebellion in 1822, one of the people that was one of the leaders was named Gullah Jack. And Gullah Jack was a conjurer. He was a hoodoo man. He was a leader of the people in this area, which is called the Sea Islands. But he was also African born. He was believed to have handed out charms and artifacts for the other conspirators so they would not be harmed, so that when they came to fight, they would not have to struggle. So Gullah Jack, of course, and the other conspirators were caught. They were betrayed by someone who gave the conspiracy away, and they were caught by the Charleston militia and tried and executed. But I'm mentioning this here because this is a prime example of the way that Black magic was used to marshal, aggressive, and violently defend a group of people. The next story has a happier ending, and I'll use this to end. All of you are familiar with the great African-American abolitionist and statesman Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a slave in Maryland, and he was a young man. He was in his early 20s, and he decided that he had enough. He was going to run away. He couldn't take it anymore. Okay. And so he ran away. He hid in the woods, and he was going to make his way north. He says, and this is all written in his autobiography, he said he met a conjure man by the name of Sandy Jenkins. And Jenkins found Douglass. He had been away for days. He was hungry. He was cold. He was shivering. And Jenkins gave him what he says was a root. We are pretty certain that it was the High John root. He said that if you take this root, Frederick Douglass, it will prevent any white man from hurting you and from hitting you. So Douglass writes in his autobiography, he didn't believe it. He's like, whatever, I'll take the thing. And then he says, I can't survive out here. He goes back home. When he goes back home, he sees the master, he sees the slave owner. They look at each other, and then he turns and he walks away. And Douglass is like, that's very strange. The next day, however, and this is the very famous part of his autobiography, which is, if you haven't read it, it's required reading for everyone. It's just called Autobiography of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The next day, the slave master comes out and he's going to abuse Frederick. Okay, this was very, very common for Black men, enslaved Black men, to be abused, whipped. And for the first time in his life, Douglass says he fought back and he basically beat his ass. He beat the slave owner. And he says in his diary, he says in his journal, this was the moment when the slave became a man. He is carrying a root that looks very much like it's sort of a phallic root. It looks like manhood and protection, personified in High John. We don't know, because Douglas never tells us, whether it was the root that gave him courage and protection, but the fact that he mentions this, all right, it's not a matter of belief. It was in that moment that he fought back. So coming down to the present day, after emancipation, Hudu changes. After people leave the South, enslaved people, after emancipation, they leave the South, they go into the cities, and Hudu becomes more, I will say, urbanized. As a result, people begin to buy and sell. It becomes more of a commodity than a tradition of cultural resistance. And that actually is where, you know, it also gets picked up by Hollywood in the 20th century as a kind of meme, as a kind of, you know, racist signifier. So Hudu changes after slavery, all right? But this is the thing that gives me hope. And this is my last story. And this is what I'm doing research on right now. I spoke to one contemporary Hudu worker. Her name is Sam. Sam learned the tradition from her elders, which is how you learn it. But you know, you can also study books. She considers herself a social media influencer. She's someone who's well known on apps and sites. You know, you guys. She's a Black woman. She's in her late 20s. Last year, Sam took part in the protests for racial justice that took place across the United States. As a Hudu worker, she told me, I can actually stop sharing this. As a Hudu worker, she told me that she, I'm gonna, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
really
because
well.
I see that my mute thing. Okay, I see two versions of me on the screen. So Sam told me she took part in the protests for racial justice last year. And as a Hudu worker, she said she wanted to bring the spirit of resistance and support the social movement. So what she ended up doing was a very traditional Hudu ritual. First, she collected and invoked High John the Conqueror, as we just saw, the heroic spirit that takes the form of a plant. She fed him, she blessed him, and then she distributed the High John roots to other activists in the street, the Frontline Resistors. This enactment, of course, reminds us of Frederick Douglass. It reminds us of Gullah Jack. It is the way of the ancestors returning to the present, all right? So it's very suggestive that you can see in the current day, the conjure woman, Sam, has raised the ancestral traditions in a new historical context. So it raises all kinds of questions about contemporary Hudu workers and practitioners. Can they model their practices of older traditions of collective struggle and resistance to address some of the ills in society today, intergenerational trauma, violence, and so forth? Can Black magic be used to marshal the same spirit of resistance as it did for the African ancestors? And so this is the question that I have. It's something that I'm looking at, and it's fascinating to me. Okay, so this is where I want to end, but several things I just want to maybe have you discuss or nudge you in the direction. Since we're thinking about Black magic and Black spirituality as a kind of resistance, and part of that resistance is not only healing of, you know, not just the social body, but the physical body as well, but also harming. What is the ethics of using harm, violence, destruction even, as the slave forebearers did, all right? So in slavery, as you all know, you know, the law turned things upside down. Human beings were property. They didn't own themselves, all right? So in order to survive, they have to twist and bend the law. If they become Christians, they can go one way. If they adopt these Hudu traditions, they can say, I have to defend myself. And sometimes defending myself means that I have to do something violent. Christianity, of course, doesn't allow for that. Christianity is a religion of pacifism that says you resist by turning the other cheek. All right, so the question that I often like to ask people is, in the magical system, all those rules are off. What do we think about a system in the 21st century that is not pacifist, but it is saying resistance requires sometimes aggressive violence. It requires the energy of those Black Haitian people who freed themselves out of slavery. extreme violence. It wouldn't have happened any other way. So it's one of the things I throw out there because I think it's telling us that there's not a right or wrong. There's not a kind of there's not the kind of morality that we can impose on this as we would from other religious traditions. So that's just one thing I throw out there as we think about whether Black magic matters today. Okay, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Yvonne. That was a very powerful lecture. And yeah, I think it's time for having a conversation. So I would like to invite the participants to, okay, they're raining like today in Berlin.
Okay, I'm going to type while you're asking questions. I'm going to type.
Yes, they're asking questions. So we have the first one. So let's go with Eden, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this great presentation. So when you were talking about magic, I quickly thought about capoeira, the self-defense / dance movement created by the African slaves in Brazil. So I was also thinking about how they perceived the indigenous black magic practices into capoeira and kind of transformed into a performance, but also talking about going around that occupation or going around that white supremacy without actually putting a lot of violence into it. That's why their movements are a bit like Matrix kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, they're bending and doing really interesting movements. So when you were talking, I immediately thought about it. And what do you think about the relationship between the feminist movement and the witchcraft issue? Because they also talk about women as witches and, you know, burning the witches and all that. We have the great legacy of witchcraft among women and how they were demonized. And because for me, we can find a lot of common things between the two struggles and demonizing by the white male, per se, white male, towards the suppressed group and saying that they're simply magicians because they're not able to explain it, right? So I don't know, I'm just brainstorming here, but I wanted to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a real parallel to your second point. There's a real parallel to witchcraft and the history of witchcraft and the repression of witches to the point where they were also killed, where they were also, you know, Christianity. I mean, this is the story in colonial America. Christianity comes after the witch and literally, you know, you kill the witch. So there's very, very interesting parallel between the experience of women who had supernatural power and the Hoodoo practitioners. One of the big differences is, though, that because Hoodoo was in many ways underground, it was, you know, everyone in the enslaved community who knew who the leader was. It was very hard for outsiders to say, you're a witch, you're a conjurer, let's go after you. Whereas for witches, at least in colonial America, it was used as a way to keep women down. So very important parallels. And it's fascinating to me, there are many African-American witches who are recovering the divine feminine as a kind of spiritual resistance. So I think they're closely parallel, even to the point where Wicca, which is a pagan religion, contains elements of magic. So you also have this interesting interplay between magic and religion. Your earlier response about capoeira, I hadn't thought about it that way, except that from what I know about capoeira, and there's also a Congo style of they call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I think is insulting. But I think this is where you look at where the styles of self-defense come from, because perhaps the style of movement and evasion or nonviolence, or not even nonviolent, but sort of hiding the violence, is specific to the Congo tradition. The Congo tradition is very different from the Yoruba tradition, which is very different from the Fon tradition. So wonderful example, but this is where we have to really say, oh, what is the indigenous African religion behind that, okay? And then when we get to the United States, all of that is just mixed up. It's mixed up, and different things are brought together. And this is, of course, one of the tragedies of the Middle Passage, that people cannot even find their original nation. They cannot even they don't know who their ancestors were. So really, really good parallels, good, wonderful examples there. Thank you for that. Good.
Great.
Any other questions?
Yes, I think next will be Chloe.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about the examples you gave with the root. For example, the story in Douglas's biography about how it didn't matter whether he believed it or not. The fact is that he mentioned it, and then goes on to tell the story of how he defeats beats up the master. And then also the example that you gave in the protests of the person that you knew doing this kind of ritual. And it seems like in both of these examples, it's not so much about whether you believe in some kind of spiritual magic or not, but it's more about what they mean and what they signify. And this relates, I guess, to what you said about how using objects for this. And I just wondered, I wondered whether you, in what you think, maybe, I don't know what my question is, but more like, it seems like you're more interested in how it's used for resistance rather than kind of magical spiritual practice. I don't know if that's correct or not. And then I think that's interesting also, the question that you gave about the ethics of violence, because it's not, I don't know, it could be framed, if you talk about magic and thought about it on a surface level, as like using magic for violence, but I feel like you don't necessarily mean that.
Yes.
And
yes. Yeah, exactly. So there's two questions in there. I'm actually very interested in the technicality of magic. The resistance thing is something that's coming up because of where we are in time. The question of belief and whether it works, there have been people who've looked at magic as a kind of metaphor, right? It's not a matter of belief at all, but you use certain symbols like art. You use a symbol and it evokes a certain feeling, and then that creates the world for you. I think that's very important. What's distinctive about Black magic or about Hoodoo is that it is born in this context in which there are very few options. So it is necessarily born of resistance. You can study comparative magic. You can study magic all over the world because it's universal. But there's something about this one that is always pushing against the reality in which these enslaved Black people belong. The question that I want to know is, we're no longer enslaved. Can we bring that same sort of energy, that culture, that sensibility into the present day? And so when I talk about resistance, I see people doing that. I'm not sure what I think about that. I see people doing that, but they're not enslaved. There's another issue that I'll just bring in here in case you all want to read more about it. That the ethics of, it's not even an ethical issue, it's a cultural issue. Given that so much of Black magic was stolen, let's just say that, commodified, turned into voodoo, the question now is this something that belongs to Black people, even though Black people are no longer enslaved? So most of the practitioners that I've talked to that are young, and there's a generational divide, say, this is ours, okay? And the only way for you to learn about magic, practice magic, Black magic, is to have ancestors who were enslaved. Now, people in my generation, they're like, no, this is for everybody, and I can sell my goodies. So there's a real interesting sort of political identity-based sensibility among young people today. They're like, this is ours, young Black people, this is ours. Doesn't matter whether you believe, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a Muslim, as long as you are Black. This is part of yours. And we can bring the spirit of resistance in. And I think that's very interesting and kind of controversial. So I kind of went away from your question. like I do, but it's a very, very good question. But for me, I'm deeply interested in the technical, like, well, yeah, it works. Well, how does it work? Does it work through metaphor? Does it work through, does the leaf have a certain power? Does it work through spirits? So, but I don't talk about that because people, you know, they get scientific and they're like, no, it can't work. But actually magic works in every way that you think it works, in the same way that prayer works. You see the difference? Okay, all right. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question. Was that helpful? Okay. Okay.
Great. Okay.
You're wonderful.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this so much. Kayla, please.
Hi, I'm thinking about your question about aggression, and I'm thinking about trauma responses and how trauma is carried through our DNA through the central nervous system, and I guess I'm curious if you think that aggression would have a place prior to colonization and prior to slavery, because I mean, not to pan-indigenize, but I feel like a lot of indigenous cultures speak of a burden, like harming another being as being a burden, and so I'm just curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, really, really good question. So most indigenous religions in Africa were, I call them the original nature religions. And I concur that there's this sense that since we're unified with the earth and with nature, one would not harm or one would not do violence to them. In the religious systems themselves, though, there's an outlet for that. So, and I mentioned the religion of Vodun in Benin and Togo. In those religions, one of the ways that the divinities, the divine beings are worshipped or incorporated is through a process, I think it's a magical process, through a process of spirit possession. And there are hundreds of these spirits, these Vodun. One of the prominent families of these spirits, they are aggressive. They're I'll give you a parallel. In Greek and Roman mythology, you have the god of war, and you have all the minions of the god of war. In African traditions, you have a similar thing. So one way to let those aggressive tendencies out is to bring and embody the spirit of war. And as I said in the beginning, wonderful ritual, dancing, dancing. Africans love to dance and African Americans love to dance. But to bring that, embody that aggression. You also have a spirit of love. You have a spirit of sickness. So every kind of natural aspect of the world is characterized by a spirit. One way for people, and this is one of the things that people argue about religion, it helps you to let off steam. All of the African religions, there's a lot of ways to let off steam. Using the drum, using the vibration of the drum with the nervous system is one way to do it. So I really think you're onto something there. We never really get to that point where we actually talk about the science of religious experience itself, because these are the other religions. They're primitive. They're, people jumping up and down. But those ritual actions may in fact do the thing that you're suggesting. All right. So I always like to go back to the indigenous example. After that Middle Passage, after slavery, all bets are off because so much of it is fragmented and lost, and people are trying to put it back together. But that's a very good question. And I love that approach because it takes religious experience seriously. It has a function. It's not just people jumping around having fun, although they have fun, but it has a function. It's efficacious, that's the word. Does that make sense? Really, really good question. I appreciate that. Thank you. Good. This is good. Y'all are so bright. You're very bright. You're a very bright group. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. They are incredible.
Yeah.
And next we go with Francisco.
Thank you, Professor. Listening to your lecture, I was wondering if there's a value system or morals inside Hudu. And also I have another question. What's the relationship with, let's say, in Judeo-Christian tradition, like devilish presences or spirits, but within Hudu? Thank you.
Yeah. For the latter question, you'll find more of the relationship with Christianity. I mean, not that it's there, but with the Catholicism. So in New Orleans, as I mentioned, you had both Hudu and you had Black religion. Black Catholicism sort of bridged the gap. So you have, of course, Catholicism all over the world has a very rich pantheon of saints and deities and angels and all kinds of things. So Hudu can incorporate those beings. So that's where you'll find that. Your first question, though, it's such a good question. And restate it, because I think you're asking me about the value system, but you have something on your mind when you say the value system. Just restate that part for me.
Yeah, is it in the nature of Hudu like a way to make a judgment of value? This is good or this is bad? Because I think it's related also to like this ethical position that you were talking about, using the potential of Hudu to harm our people in this day and time. But yes, because for me, the answer would be within Hudu itself. If there's such a thing as like a Hudu morals, maybe, or Hudu value system, in a way to be able to discern what is good and what is bad within its own logic.
Yeah. That is such a good question. I think that it's a complicated question. In many of the African indigenous traditions that these magic derives from, you don't have a sharp division between good and evil. You don't have the same sort of moral construct in indigenous cultures, all right? You certainly don't have a devil as you do in Christianity or so forth. So you don't have that sharp line to begin with. But from what I've seen, and I've looked at sources from that period of slavery, there is a kind of morality there, in that the highest value in the community is survival, all right? Survival. If that means, however, that you have to do harm to someone else, so be it. I've also seen this value system in ceremonial magic, European magic. It's do as thou will. And, this is the whole of the law, do as thou will. So, some would say, well, that's not moral at all, but you have to think about the moral system of slavery itself. You don't own yourself. You don't own your will. It's presumed you have no agency. In some ways, you're not even human. So within that system of slavery, what kind of morality could develop? Well, the slaves had the choice of becoming Christians and adopting that moral system, or adopting a system that would allow them to survive no matter what. It's not pretty, and it's really hard for us to impose a morality on that. I mentioned the Denmark VC rebellion. One of the more famous rebellions involved Nat Turner, who was a Christian. Nat Turner and his conspirators, they slaughtered men, women, and children. And someone would say, well, that's not very moral at all. That's actually hatred. And I'm like, these people were uprising against slavery, which was probably the most immoral system. So it gets complicated, and you find yourself in a situation of having to explain and over-explain. But I see, as far as the value is concerned, survival of the individual, because the magic is very individual, and then the community, in the case of these community-based uprisings and so forth. So it's really interesting. I don't know if that applies today. So, and that to me, I don't know if we can bring those same sorts of values because it was in slavery to the present. And that's something I really want to know more about. That's a really good question. All right. I see a question over here on the board. I'm gonna read it really quickly. It says it's a bit technical, but I would like to know the underlying principle of magic for world making. If we say language, what is it body and movement? It is absolutely body and movement and words. Okay, so it's like you create the word. I love this stuff because that's my other hat. I like to think about magic and how it actually works. So it's ritual always consists of bodily movement. But it's sometimes, it does come down to the narration, the creation. But the reason that we accompany movement, hands, dance with the narration is because, it's the power of gesture. So absolutely, you want to know the bottom line. You want to know, wow, is it really about language? Is it, is it about language? I don't know. I know that when one works with the spirit of the leaf and communicates with the leaf, and the leaf tells us, oh, this is what you use us to cure a headache. I'm just making something up. That communication may not be oral at all. It may be, it may be a psychic thing. So the bottom line for me, as far as magic, is establishing a relationship between the thing, the object, and the subject, and effacing that, so that, you are the leaf. And so you can hear and feel the leaf. You are the spirit that you are communicating with. Now that's more elaborate than my sources can give me, because I'm reading sources from slavery, and it's really hard to find out what Black people are thinking. But I think that's a principle of magic. Does that, I know this is from Muhammad. Does that make sense at all, though? Because this you can tell I get really excited about this, because this is the technical stuff, but you don't get much from that from the Black folk, because we really don't hear the voices of African American ancestors. They're that deep in there, we don't hear their voices. But that's a cool question, a really good question. There's a lot of good questions popping up. It's like, I love it.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's give chance to Caro, and maybe later we go with you, Chloe.
Yeah.
So Caro.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the concept of reincarnation or afterlife, or what happens to your soul after you die is, especially seeing that the highest value is survival.
Yeah. So this is a question for religion. So, and because Hoodoo is magic, the thing that Hoodoo is most concerned with is the present moment, the present second. All right, what is happening in that space? So in that present moment, you're alive, you're infinite, which, but as far as a sort of a map or a framework of, what happens to the soul, you'll find those more in the religion realm. And in most of the African religions I can think of, the soul travels through time. So there is a notion of reincarnation, but in magic, it is always a present time action. It's always a present time thought. So it doesn't matter, because in present time, you are forever. You're, I mean, it's hard to say that. It sounds really weird to say that, but you're there. You're there, past, present, and future. Does that make sense at all? It might not. It's like a weird, it's esoteric. Yeah. Good question. But that question is answered in the religion category and not so much the magic category. Good. Right.
Okay, Chloe.
Kayla actually said she also had another question.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Okay. Kayla said that she had.
Okay. Kayla, feel free to ask.
So I'm curious about the artifacts, and if it, I'm thinking about it as a relationship with an item, and when a person is transferring magic to that item, is it through the craftsmanship? Is it through the materials, or is it like everything, or the intent? Yeah. So this is good. And I'll give you the short answer that tells you to go look this up in another book. One of the ways that African magic works is through something called metaphoric and metonym and metaphor. So the metaphoric relationship is basically the principle of like. What is it? Like produces like. So Robert Farris Thompson is someone who has talked about, just, you can do a search for Robert Farris Thompson, metonym and metaphor. And then our favorite English anthropologist, James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, gives us the first theory of magic. So the way that he says it's like, he gives two principles, this idea of sympathy, that something that has been in contact with something else will affect a thing. And then the other theory, the metaphor, is something that looks like something else will affect the thing. So there are two strands of magic in all magics, all right? The magic that you do when you want something to happen that is, I'll just say metaphorical, that is like another thing. And then the other kind of magic, which is very popular with African American people, where you take a piece of hair, or you take a piece of a fingernail, or you take a piece of clothing, the thing that was associated with the person
is a surrogate for the person. That's basically how it works. So look up Fraser Magic and Robert Farris Thompson, because Robert Farris Thompson goes a little bit deeper into the African style, but Fraser is the guy who invented the theory of all magics. And I think it holds up. He wrote this thing in the late 1800s. I think it really holds up if you're interested, as I am, in the technical side, like how it actually works. When we bring in conjure, which is the use of the spirits, all bets are off, because spirits are like you and me. They're intelligent. They're not just stable objects. They're not just sitting there. So they also have a will and an intent. All right. So that's another area of magic. And that's the one that I think makes people most nervous, even though, you know, I think dead people are people too. This is why we call this an ancestral tradition, but it makes people nervous when you're talking about talking to dead people or things like that. And that's where we get a lot of the voodoo memes, like the, you know, the horrible, violent, gruesome memes. Anyway, good question. But definitely look up Fraser's Golden Bough, or Golden Bough. And you can find it online. It's a really good guide to the technicality of magic. I love this class. You get to ask me things that I don't normally answer. Usually the questions are, oh yes, that's how it's spelled, metonymy and metaphor. Metonym and metaphor. Perfect. All right. Who said that? Who said that?
Amir Mohammed.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We can squeeze in the last question. So,
Okay.
Chloe.
All right.
I just wanted to ask what, when I asked my question before, you mentioned how practitioners of Black magic now are much more for saying that it's for people that have ancestors that practiced it, whereas people of your generation weren't like that. So I wondered if you had a theory why, because you said that you found that interesting.
Yes, I find it interesting because so many young people are leaving the traditional religions. So there's space for them to explore ancestor veneration in ways that they couldn't before. Now, there is a form of ancestor veneration in Christianity, but most of the people from my generation, they're steeped in the Christian tradition, or they just left it completely. So the prominence given to ancestor veneration and ancestral remembrance is at an all-time high now. And my theory is that for young people, it is trying to reclaim the past, trying to find something of value in the past that they can use in the present. That wasn't really the concern for this older generation. The older generation wanted to maintain the tradition, maybe make a little money off of it, you know. And so it was a different emphasis. Now I really see this is part of the resistance of what it means to be here now, where, I mean, not that we old folk didn't resist, but it was just a different style. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Good, very good. Ancestors are so important today. And I do think it's because people are leaving the traditional religions because you don't find that sort of thing there. And that's something I hope that you explore that in your series here, because, you know, I like to tell people, because the claim is, oh, you know, you guys are racist. You know, you all are racist. You won't share your Hoodoo tradition with the world. And the response that I've heard is, look, everyone has ancestors. My ancestors were enslaved, they say. Your ancestors might have been enslaved in a different way. So you follow the ancestors, and there's a wisdom there that can be brought again. So there's controversies there, and apparently there's people fighting online about it, but I find that the younger generation, especially now, there's so no nonsense about it. It's like, let's just get on with this. So, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Thank you. You've given so many great questions and so much food for thought for me as I work on this stuff. So I'm very happy about that.
Yvonne, you're great. And I'm sure that some participants would like at some point to get in touch with you as they progress with the research. What would be the best way for them to get in touch?
Okay, I'd like to introduce people to my blog. I'm going to put it up there. I had it on the main screen. It's called academichoodoo.com. And there's a contact there. Also, the books that I posted, I think I posted 3 references. really, really good. And my book is in there because my book is really good. If you want to follow up on some of this information today, I think I sent it in the first email conversation that I had with Chireau. I sent 3 books or 3 book titles. Check them out and see if your questions are answered there. But I would love to hear from you if you want to explore some of this further.